Shalom, everyone. Thank you for joining us again as we continue our complex story of the creation of a meeting place between God and the Israelites, the creation of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and the final inauguration of all its rituals, of its priesthood, the 8th day. And that's how our Parsha begins. After 7 days of miluim, which we talked about last week, inauguration, which means filling in, somewhere fitting these priests into their role, fitting them into their costumes, which is a process of filling and of coming to fulfill a certain public role in society. 7 days they've been through this, and on the 8th day, Vayihi Bayom Hashmini, that's how our Parsha begins. And it was on the 8th day. Now, that little connective, and it was, it's very, very common, of course, Vayihi, is associated by midrashic traditions with two opposite states of mind. It's really rather confusing. It's not very helpful. Sometimes it's associated with a moment of tsar, of tzara, of something going wrong. Vayihi, vai, as if you're in mourning. And sometimes, as here, the association is on the contrary, with joy. Vayihi, what does the midrash say? Vayihi, this was a day of simcha l'Hashem. This was the day of God's rejoicing. This is the day, it was as happy for God as the day on which he created the world. That also took 7 days. And here now comes the 8th day, but it bears some relationship in God's experience, as it were, in the divine experience of his world. This parallels that original creation, a sense of achievement, a sense of a personal wish of God to create a world out of nothing, a wish that perhaps is hard to understand sometimes. Why did he need to bring so much trouble on himself? There he was, reigning in solitary bliss. However, I won't go into all the theological complexities of that. But he does it, and clearly it's a moment of great satisfaction for God. And this is the parallel now, when finally his presence can come to dwell in a structure made by human hands. That he will fill the Mishkan. He will really live in the Mishkan. And this moment of great joy is paralleled by the human reaction. So what are the Israelites experiencing at this time? I'm looking now at the first chapter of our Parsha, chapter 9, which begins with God telling Moshe to call Aaron and his sons and everyone to start all the rituals of sacrifice that will finally bring the Mishkan into operation. The first instruction to Aaron is Kach lecha egel, take for yourself a calf. Note that, keep that somewhere on the edges of your mind, and then follow the many, many details of sacrifices that will now make it possible for God indeed to fill the Mishkan. And the chapter ends then with a strange movement. I'm looking at chapter 9, verse 23. Vayavo Moshe v'Aaron el ohel moed. Moshe and Aaron went into the tent of assembly. Vayetzu, and they came out. Why did they go in order to come out? What kind of movement is that? It doesn't seem very purposeful. Vayivarachu et ha'am, and they blessed the people. Now they've already blessed the people. So why are they re-blessing the people now? Vayera kvod Hashem el kol ha'am. And the glory of God appeared to the whole people. The people are outside the Mishkan. But they have some kind of visual impression that's called the glory of God, whether it's fire or we don't know exactly what it is perhaps. But the next pasuk helps us. The next verse helps us. Vatetzei esh milifnei Hashem, and a fire came out from the presence of God, which means from the Holy of Holies. That's the presence of God, the heart of the mystery, the heart of the Mishkan. And it consumed, vatochal, on the altar, the burnt offering and the fats. Vayar kol ha'am, and the whole people saw this vision of fire doing what fire does, which is to consume sacrifices. This is an expression of goodwill on the part of God. Vayaronu, and the people exulted. And I want to pause there now for our first little comment. Vayaronu, they exulted in song. Rina, kol rina, is always the voice. Rina is the voice exulting in song. It's an ecstatic moment of song. So clearly the people are paralleling the divine experience of joy, or so it seems. Vayiplu al panehem, and they fell on their faces. And that already brings us down to earth. What does it mean to fall on your face? In prayer? In a kind of deep thoughtfulness? What has happened to the ecstasy? Is this the same as the ecstasy? Is it the same mood? It seems in a way a kind of sober element to fall on your face, almost like a kind of collapse. They collapsed on their faces. And then the next chapter continues with the tragic story of the two sons of Aaron who are burnt when they bring strange fire. We'll come back to this very shortly, since that is our main subject, of course. But at the moment, here is the moment of the glory of God appearing. It's the moment of apotheosis, of fulfilling of hope and expectation and ecstasy. There is that rina. Have a look at number 1 on your page. And you can see the Sfatimet, 19th century Hasidic master, commenting on this word. It doesn't tell you what they said, he said. It tells you that they sang, but it doesn't give you the words. Where are the words of the song? And then he goes on to make this Kabbalistic statement. He's drawn it from the Zohar, ultimately. He says, this was the first song that the people ever sang. They opened up on the faculty of singing at when? When was the great song sung? That was at the crossing of the Red Sea. This was the same song, held over somewhere, held over for future generations, for future such events of enormous, ecstatic, miraculous joy. And they are now drawing on that resource of joy and song that they first exercised there at the Red Sea. Right? That's how he begins here. Because that was a song for all generations who would be able to draw on it at certain moments. And then the story gets complicated, as it often does with the Sfatimet. He is interested in this arc of the narrative, which begins with ecstasy and then moves into loss, absence, and then return. As we saw last week with the clouds of glory that were there, and then they weren't there, and then they came back again. And what we have here is, because of the sin of the golden calf, the song, the faculty of song, dried up in them. Nifsak mehem. They couldn't do that anymore. And then through their tikkun, through their repair of themselves somewhere, they returned to that place of song. They returned again to having some access to singing. And a hint of this is given in the Zohar, where it says that from the time of the Red Sea, the Song of the Red Sea, there was never joy again as like this joy that happened on the 8th day. Right? They had to wait from that time to now, including Mount Sinai. That also was not a time of joy and singing. But this 8th day in which God comes to live among them, that is an equivalent resource of song and exaltation. But the one difference between the Red Sea, the song at the Red Sea, and this song that they sing at this point, as Sfatimet pointed out, is that we don't have the words now. Then we were given the words. Now we are given just the fact of there being singing of this ecstatic kind. What is the difference between, right? What could one imagine to be the difference between a song with words and a song without words? Is it better? Is it worse? If you do have the words, if you don't, is a song to which you sing tra-la-la, or you hum along, what is the difference between that and a song that is very clearly associated with a poem? And what the Sfatimet wants to suggest very delicately is that they no longer are in the same solid place of recognizing a miracle in their lives. That because of the experience of the golden calf, they've been emptied out. And they now experience joy in a different, like with a different metabolism almost, with a different rhythm. It's a rhythm that's more sharp and ecstatic and explosive. It doesn't yield to words. It's just an outburst of melody without words. And that's a very different kind of music from the music that comes with words. It's like the difference between a Baal Tshuva and a perfect tzaddik. This is a point he likes to make often. Perfect tzaddik is somehow stable. He's never, nothing, no shadow has ever crossed his horizon. The Baal Tshuva, the penitent, someone who has gone through a valley of darkness of some kind, is in a different situation. He has known what it is to be emptied out and to be filled again. And that's a different kind of song. Now, this is picking up some of what we talked about last week, and I just want to flash back very, very briefly. We talked about filling, the days of filling, the priests filling into their role, being filled up. And we talked about being filled internally in the end, the desire to contain God within one. And in contrast to that image, there is the image of emptiness. And the emptiness is what happens as an effect of the golden calf. I want to explore this more today. As an effect of the golden calf, there is the experience, and we saw it last week in source after source, the experience of not being full, of waking up, of seeing the Mishkan surrounded by cloud, which meant that God was there. And then during the night, the Mishkan is burnt up in fire, and the people cry out, Lerek Yaganu. All the work we have done to make this container for God, to fill ourselves up with God's presence, it's all been for emptiness, for nothing, Lerek. And that experience of deep emptiness, and then waking up in the morning and finding again that this time there is a cloud and it is containing hakafa, mekif, is encompassing the Mishkan. So the movement from being held, being full, to being empty, and to being full again. And the result of that process is an experience of knowledge. What the people are looking for is not the original experience of fullness, but what they have now, which is after the fall. After they've been emptied out, what they're looking for is some confirmation that God still wants them and wants to be with them. And when they achieve that, the depth of the experience is much greater in a way. It's more excruciating, right? It's sharper than the original experience of joy. Now they know things. They know that they're being surrounded by those pillars of cloud. At first they were unconscious, but having gone through this history of emptiness, they now know. When is there full knowledge? Not in this world. There's no full filling in this world. How do we know that? Well, there is that pasuk. I don't know if we actually got to this last week, so I'll just fit it in here. Az yimale schok pinu. At that time, our mouths will be filled with laughter, says the verse in Psalms. And on that, the midrash says, till that time, even when the Mishkan is just about to come together, everything is about to happen, there is always that possibility of things falling apart. And therefore, we can't let our mouths be filled with laughter. We can't laugh wholeheartedly in this world. Our laughter will always be a rather complex affair, a kind of mixture of laughter and tears, perhaps. As yimale, in the world to come, there will be that full laughter that we only have glimpses of. There are moments when we feel that paroxysm coming upon us, but it comes upon us in a way that is conditioned by the conditions of this world, by the failures of this world. And that perhaps is why there's all that reference that we talked about last week to simcha yetera, exceeding joy, excessive joy, the kind of joy that twists your mouth a little bit as you're laughing, because there are other associations as well. You've gone through a great deal to get to this point. And so there is that sense of something almost too much that we carry with us now as human beings who know about the idol, who know about that dark experience, which I want to go into a little more today. And today we look in more detail. Here you have this great day of joy. Now it focuses on the real moment, the apotheosis of joy. And at that very moment, let's read in the text, the beginning of chapter 10, the terrible, inexplicable story, right? It's a mysterious and violent story of the death of Aaron's sons. The sons of Aaron, chapter 10, verse 1, took, Nadav and Avihu were their names, each took his own incense pan, and they placed in them fire, and they placed upon it incense, and they brought it as a sacrifice into the presence of God. Foreign fire, Esh Zara, fire that doesn't really belong here and now. Asher lo tziva otam, which God never commanded them. Somehow this was private initiative on their part. What is motivating them to justify what follows? Vatetse esh milifnei Hashem. As we read it before, the same sentence. And a fire came forth from the presence of God. That same fire, perhaps, that manifested the presence of God and the favor of God, now came out and also consumed, vatochal, but this time not the sacrifices. And that terrible, flat, quiet word at the end of the phrase. The fire came out from the presence of God and consumed them. And they died in the presence of God. Now, it's a shocking story. And commentaries forever have been exercised trying to explain what did they do, these two young men, to deserve such a dreadful fate at the very moment, the climactic moment of the appearance of the glory of God, which was to justify and atone and let the people know that God had atoned for that sin. At that very moment, this happens. Have a look at the Rashbam. I'm not going to try to sum up all the other readings. There are many. I once counted among the classical commentaries something like 15 different interpretations. Attempts to understand what was their sin, these two young men. And what I want to share with you today is an extraordinary commentary by the Rashbam. Rashbam is Rashi's grandson, who is noted for his adhering to what we call pshat. That is, he doesn't use midrash all that much. He does occasionally. But he is really looking, he's striking among the commentaries for really looking for the plain contextual meaning of the verses that gives the best possible reconstruction of the meaning. You put things together in a way that makes a lot of sense and perhaps is better than any other way. And this is what he has to offer now. Moshe and Aaron went into the Ohel Moed. What for? To pray that the fire should come down. That is, Moshe and Aaron are not feeling very calm at this moment. It's as if the fire is a bit overdue. They've done everything. They've offered all the sacrifices. The moment has come, and nothing has happened. Lo yarda hashchina. The Shekhinah, the presence of God, has not come down, right? Doesn't. So Rashbam just says they're going in to pray because it's a kind of emergency prayer. They go in and they come out again, and they bless the people, right? And then the glory of God does appear. And how does that happen then? And here is the Rashbam scenario, his chronology. What's the timing here? A fire came out from the Holy of Holies, that's the presence of God, went by way of the golden altar, the incense altar, which is right nearby there, in order to offer incense offerings, and which come before the animal offerings, which are outside the Mishkan. But when the fire got to the incense altar, which is right near the Holy of Holies, it found the children of Aaron there, standing beside the golden altar, and burned them. And after that, the fire continued on its trajectory through them to the outer altar, where it consumed the sacrifices. So you have this terrible twinning, this terrible pairing of two objects of consumption. And the fire is on its way, on its ruthless way, and it finds the children of Aaron right there with their fire, right there by the incense altar. And on its way, it burns them and then goes out to do its joyful task of consuming the sacrifices. So there's something ruthless about this fire. It's both the good news and the bad news in one sweep. But go and look now at the second passage. It's in number 3. The next verse, what does Rashbam have to say about that? And this is really where he turns, certainly my ideas, on their head. I think on the whole, for many years, I was going on the idea that these young men were so full of ecstasy at the appearance of God that they began to act on their private initiative. In sheer ecstasy and abounding love for God, mystical love, they went beyond their boundaries and they did something that God hadn't, in Hasidic fervor, to be anachronistic. They did something that God had not commanded and they're punished for that. That nevertheless, there are rules and there are laws. But look at what Rashbam says. Almost the opposite. Number 3. When did this death of Nadav and Avihu happen? It happened before the fire had come out. When did they take their fire pans? Before the fire had come out from God's presence. These young men had already taken their incense pans in order to offer incense right there inside on the golden altar. Because after all, incense comes before, that incense of the morning comes before the animal offerings of every day. But what did these young men do? They put on their fire pans foreign fire which God had not commanded. God had not commanded them by Yom Hazeh. And this is now the narrative, the crucial narrative of the Rashbam. What these young men did was do what God did not want them to do on this day of all days. Every other day, it would have been perfectly in order for them to take fire from their own ovens and put them on the incense pans and offer the incense sacrifice. On this day, God wanted that they should wait for the fire to come out from God to them. And they couldn't bear the weight. They were waiting for that descent of fire from above. And it wasn't a good thing to bring their own private fire. Ish min hediot, fire from your own oven, as one midrash puts it. One midrash puts it like this. He doesn't quote this here, but it has them saying rather practically and commonsensically, how can you make a fire unless you have, you take fire from an oven? We have an oven, we have a fire source, so let's be practical about it. Let's get things going around here. And in being so very practical, so very utilitarian, they are preventing the essential moment of the day, which is the day of the sanctification of God, who will come from heaven, not aided by human fire, but bring a divine fire, and in that way, the people will become aware of a revelation of atonement, of forgiveness, of a meeting with God. And what do these young men do? In sheer, what can I call it? Not enthusiasm. It's impatience. It's a sense of the normative. That's what I want to emphasize, and what I think the Rashbam is getting at. This is what you do every day. And they love what you do every day. They love ceremony, ritual, doing the right thing. What you have got used to thinking through 7 days of preparation, this is the thing to do. It's the normative thing to do. And as priests, that's their role, to do the normative thing, to offer the right rituals. The only thing is, this is not every day. And on this day, everything that they're normally commanded to do is not commanded today. Now they have to be passive. They have to contain themselves in patience and wait. Right? Shimurim, that thing of holding back. There are some times when rushing forward is retreating. That is, you rush forward because you can't bear the tension of God not appearing. Everyone is having a hard time waiting. Is anything going to happen? We hope it will happen. We've invested so much in it. We're feeling empty. That was the prevailing feeling. And they are the executive arm. Now, the priests are the executive arm. And these young priests feel that's our role. We have to make it happen. Right? We know how to make it happen. The rituals make it happen. And in doing that, they have distorted the essential meaning of that one day. As a psychological problem, I found a wonderful diagnosis of this kind of state of mind. Christopher Bollas, one of the great 20th century psychoanalysts, talks about the normotic. You know, there is the neurotic, there is neurosis, we all know about that. But there's also a particular kind of neurosis that he calls normosis. That is, not being able to tolerate anything that's not normal. Being in love with the normal and the normative. Now, that strange idea, right? The idea that somewhere they're so used to, you know, the language of the rituals, they adhere to it so carefully, everything exactly as they've been trained to do it. They're set in a way, their mechanism is set to normal. And what does that mean? What Christopher Bollas describes people like this, people who are very scrupulous and who stick to the obvious routines of things. He says what they're really doing is fleeing from their dream lives, from their subjectivity, from their imagination, from everything that is not strictly regulated within them. And they are, in some way, when we say someone is going off the deep end, they are going off the shallow end. That is, they fall with a terrible bump into the shallow end of things. And there is disorder like that too. That is the inability to dream, the inability to sense the particular uncontrolled and uncontrollable experience of today. That there isn't a rule for today, and the only rule is you have to wait. You have to wait and see what happens. And that's something they can't bear to do. Now, if we take this reading, the shallow end of things, with the sense of timing that the Rashbam gives us here, it's very much like Eliyahu, the prophet Elijah, at Har Carmel, as you may remember. The idea was, Ve'esh lo tasimu, you shall not put fire on these sacrifices. Don't provide your own fire. It won't tell you anything. You have to wait for the divine fire. Now, the strain that puts people under, not to be able to use one's own initiative, which one's very used to doing, the banality of having a solution for every problem, and recognizing that this is a sacred moment. And a sacred moment is a moment of painful emptiness, of facing the emptiness, of not knowing exactly how things are going to turn out. God had said to Aaron at the beginning of the Parsha, and I want to regard this disaster that befalls the two sons of Aaron as having something to do with Aaron. That is, it has something to do with the role of priest, and with Aaron's role back then in the creation of the golden calf. That Aaron lives with that still inside him. The ghost of that haunts him. And the rituals of the priesthood, which are now given over to him, are a way of reassuring him that now he is on a regulated path where nothing like that will ever happen again. But what happens? What happens is that God is not so quick to reveal himself, to send the fire. And what seems to be required then, from the beginning of the Parsha onwards, is that you take for yourself a calf, a young calf. That is the first of the offerings. It's there as a sin offering. And that is the first of the offerings that the priesthood needs. They have to remind themselves, Aaron has to remind himself of his involvement in the sin of the golden calf. And you can see it in Rashi in number 4. Kach lecha ega. Moshe says to Aaron, take a calf for yourself. What is the lecha? Lehodia shekiper lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu al yedei egel zeh. You will take that calf, and that will broadcast, that will make it known that God has atoned for him, has bestowed atonement upon him through this calf for the making of that calf which he had made. Now, this is Rashi quoting the Sifra. In other words, the beginning of the 8th day involves going back into the stuckness, the problem, the unresolved problem of the golden calf. Confronting it, taking it for you. It has a particular role in reminding you and in confronting you with that extraordinary and catastrophic experience. And only in that, entering into the problem, will there be any possibility of atonement. Atonement will happen when you take it unto you, when it becomes functional in your particular movement of spirit. Have a look then at number 5. We said that Moshe and Aaron came into the tent of assembly, and then they came out. And here we find this in Rashi. Aaron realized that they had offered all the sacrifices, they had done all the ritual acts. That's a way of saying we have done everything we're supposed to do. We've come to the end of our equipment. That's what we are. V'lo yarda shechina liYisrael. But the presence of God has not descended among the people. Now that emphasis on what hasn't happened is something that the midrash offers us, but you don't get any real hint of it in the story in the Torah. The story in the Torah seems to be seamless. It's a movement from all the rituals and sacrifices to the appearance of God. But as we saw last week, what the midrash likes to do is to drive a wedge of failure. There is a moment when nothing is happening, when things have not yet happened. Don't think it was as easy and seamless as that. And in that moment, he was in distress. Haya mitzta'er. Aaron was distressed. And he says, I know that God is angry with me. It's very personal. He knows that he was the one who created that golden calf. And that's very unresolved for us. Did he do something wrong? Didn't he? He justified it to Moshe afterwards. Does that make it worse? Does that make it better? It's left very much in the air. But the Midrash brings it home to roost and says Aaron is feeling deeply guilty here. Not only guilty, aware of God's anger, bishvili lo yarda shechina. It's my fault that the Shekhinah has not come down among the people. And he said to Moshe, he reproached Moshe, Moshe, my brother, what have you done to me? That you brought me into this operation where I'm the one who is acting high priest here. V'nit bayashti, you've put me to shame. I am an experience of shame. And that experience of shame and of emptiness, all this work for nothing, l'rek, that is the post-golden calf experience of the high priest. His sons bear the scorch of that shame. That is, they are part of the priestly dynasty. And they are the activist part. And they know that the presence of God has to appear. Otherwise, the shame is unbearable. And they decide to do something about it. They're going to make it happen. And in that way, distort the whole event. If you have a look at the end of Rashi in number 5, you can see they came out and blessed the people. I think we touched on this last week. And again, Rashi wants to know, so what was the particular blessing this time? And he quotes from Psalms, may the pleasantness of the Lord our God be upon us. What would be the pleasure of God that would touch us? And here is the prayer. May it be your will that your presence come and dwell, that God's presence come and dwell in the work of your hands. That is the prayer that they pray for the people. What do we all want? We want God's presence to come into the Mishkan, which we have made. Are our hands creative? Have they consummated in the apocalyptic moment, in the great moment that we've been working for? And why do they pray so intensely at this moment and bless the people with this? Because it hasn't happened. all those 7 days it might have happened. They put the Mishkan together, they took it apart. So clearly it didn't happen then. And the people were ashamed. And here again the theme of shame. And they said to Moshe, all that work that we did in order that the presence of God should dwell among us, and we should know, there's that theme again, we should have the knowledge of atonement, that we've been through that and we've come to this for that golden calf. And they're in distress at this moment. When Moshe is blessing them, it's because everyone is in distress. They need the blessing. And it's at that moment that the 2 sons of Aaron decide to act out. They decide that they're not going to leave things hanging in the air any longer. Now, let's move to the Sifra in number 6, to look at a couple of extraordinary, almost hallucinatory midrashim. Number 6. Moshe says to Aaron, Krav el HaMizbeach. Perik Tet, chapter 9, verse 6. After some of the sacrifices have been named, Moshe says, now this is a thing that God has commanded you shall do, so that the glory of God does appear. As if it really is a kind of pragmatic matter. You just have to do your stuff, do it, and then the glory of God will appear. And Moshe then says to Aaron, Krav el HaMizbeach. Come close to the altar and perform your sin offering. Your sin offering, the one that is personally there for you. What you require at this moment. Come close. What does it mean to come close? Sometimes it means a good thing, to offer sacrifices, to approach, to come close to the place of God, to offer korbanot, sacrifices of intimacy with God. Sometimes it means the opposite, what the sons of Aaron experience, that they come too close. Vayikrevu vayakrivu. They offer sacrifices, but they encroach rather than approach. It's dangerous to enter into badly played intimacy with anyone. Yeah? There is intimacy and intimacy. There's one of approach and there's one of encroaching. And Moshe says to Aaron, now you do some approaching. What does that mean here? Number 6. What is this like? A parable. A human king of flesh and blood married a wife, and she was shy of him, mitbayeshet, the same word, busha. She was ashamed in some way. She was timid. And her sister came to her then and tried to cheer her up, tried to encourage her, and said to her, what did you get into this business for, if it were not to serve the king? To serve the king means to enter into your marriage relationship with the king. So there is this uneasy mixture of a marital relationship, which is also a relationship between a subject and a king. Yes, as traditional marriage relationships were among the royal dynasties. In other words, she is shy, she's in awe, perhaps she's ashamed of something, picking up that association, and she doesn't see how to do it. She's at a loss. And she's encouraged by her sister, Hagisi da'atech. Hagisi da'atech is translated here, steal yourself, I think. In other words, legayes means to mobilize yourself. Some common sense here. Just gird your loins, come, as it were. Do what you have to do. You know what marriage is all about. There's no surprise here. Just get to it. But the word gus is a gus word. Gus means somehow coarsen yourself. Right? The sister is saying to her sister, don't be so sensitive. Let's be sensible about this. You know what's required at this moment. Just go and do it. You have to never mind all your reservations and your worries and your shynesses and so on. So go ahead and serve the king. That's what Moshe said to Aaron. Here is the analogy. Aaron, my brother, why do you think you were chosen to be high priest? If it weren't that you should serve God. That was the whole point. Again, mobilize yourself, toughen up, and come and perform your service. overcome your sensitivities, your fastidiousness about your history, everything that's holding you back. You need to overcome all that and somewhere to, I think they now say man up, don't they? Something like that. But the parable of the bride gives that a strange twist, yes? There are some who say, this is related but not exactly the same thing, that the reason Aaron had to be encouraged to enter into an intimate relationship with God, to go there and do his service by the altar, yeah, right? That intimacy of being close to God, the reason he had to be encouraged was that he saw the altar suddenly in a hallucination in the form of an ox. Suddenly the horns of the altar become like the horns of an ox in his imagination, and he has a fantasy that he's looking at the golden calf. There is the golden calf, as it were, intruding from his nightmares, from his memories, dark memories, at the very moment when he's required to approach God in service. And he was afraid of it. So he's not only ashamed, but afraid. Bosh v'yareh, Rashi sums it up with those two words. That was Aaron's attitude when he had to enter into his function as a priest. The clothes alone won't do it. He's feeling very empty at this point. And then Moshe says to him, my brother, that's what you're afraid of? Hages dadcha v'krav elav. Again, toughen up and get close. Go and do your korbanot, your sacrifices there. And that's why it says, get close to the altar. Toughen up. Have a look at the next passage now, also from the Sifra, which completes this moment in the story. Moshe said to Aaron, Kach lecha egel, yeah, going back to that, take a calf for yourself. Teaches you that Moshe said to Aaron, Aaron, my brother, even though God has become reconciled, he is appeased to atone for your sins. God is in a positive state towards you, to receive you and to atone for your sins. Tzarich ata liten letoch piv shel Satan. You have to put something into Satan's mouth. What a strange image. You have to feed that which you are ashamed of, that which you are afraid of, that which makes you feel guilty. Yeah? You can't run away from it. You can't keep away from it. Go and in some way give it something. Feed it with something so that you can overcome your resistance. Send some kind of gift before you come into the holy place, lest Satan, right? Satan needs feeding, needs in some way appeasing, lest he hate you. Really, he blocks your way and doesn't let you come into the mikdash at all, and thwarts the whole function, the atoning function, the function of love for which the Mishkan was created. You have to overcome your fear and your resistance by dealing with what you are most afraid of. That is, in some way, feeding it, giving it a gift of some kind, which is uncomfortably close to pagan practices. Right? It's one of those moments when one realizes that what Chazal sometimes do, what the sages sometimes do, is take a practice that was part of the commonplace of how idols were indeed appeased, and take the psychological heart out of it, right? What is really involved here, and make it operative in the resistance to idolatry. How will one learn to fight against idolatry? By understanding something of the fantasy that one's involved in. Something very similar occurs in that strange law at the heart of Yom Kippur in the Mishkan, the goat that is sent to the demon in the wilderness. There Ramban also says, doesn't this sound terribly pagan? That you send a kind of offering to the demons of the wilderness. Aren't those goats exactly like the calves? Haven't we here given in to idolatry? And his answer is, and I deserve a much longer treatment, but I'll just put it on the table. His answer is, but this is what God commands in this case. That it's a kind of homeopathic prescription. You have to handle, you have to find a way of molding that material, the material of your basic fantasy, which has led to the golden calf. Otherwise, you will not be able to get close to God himself. And this means, on some real level, that we need to exorcise the golden calf. That is the necessary moment. The Ha'amek Davari, number 8, says rather wonderfully on this expression, come close to the altar, quotes the midrash, toughen yourself up so that you can overcome your resistances. What does that mean? Hages dadcha, he says. It doesn't just mean become enthusiastic. What it means, he says, is that Aaron was afraid to approach the altar. Moshe said to him, Hages dadcha ukrav. What is ukrav? Come close. Another meaning of the word krav is go into battle. Krav means go into battle. And he quotes from the Jerusalem Talmud, which points out rather fascinatingly that when you tell the shliach tzibur to go and daven, right, the person who is going to the chazan, the person who is going to daven for the community, and you tell him to go up onto the bima and krav, and daven and pray for the community, you don't say to him, bo hitpalel, come and pray. You say to him, bo krav, go into battle. Go into battle, that is, against everything that blocks you and impedes you. All those inner and perhaps outer forces that disqualify you somewhere, delegitimize you for that role, that make you unsure, that make you ashamed, that make you feel empty. You have to go into battle against all these dispiriting, paralyzing forces, which Satan is very good at operating. And so that is the impulse of prayer, he wants to say. The impulse of prayer is that there's something pugilistic about it. You can't only go into prayer in an appeasing state of mind. It's not there just to pray, you are there to do battle, to overcome some things in yourself, to overcome the obstacles. And that kind of double negative ends up as a positive. And that, in the end, leads to a different idea of what sacrifice is all about. Sacrifice, of course, is krav, to offer korbanot, to enter into intimacy, which means overcoming barriers, and in some way giving oneself up to an experience for which there is a very profound motive causes deep in fantasy and deep in our spiritual imagination. Jonathan Lear, the American psychoanalyst and philosopher, who I love to quote, has an expression that goes like this. He says, to accept responsibility is a very different thing from holding oneself responsible for something. Aaron is to accept responsibility, I want to say, for the golden calf. It's not so clear if he really is responsible or not, or to what measure. That is never clearly analyzed. But to accept responsibility means that what you are really saying is, that was me that did it. It wasn't something else that was doing it, it was actually me. And confronting that in oneself, which did it. As opposed to holding oneself responsible, where we are hearing the voice of the superego. There we are hearing the voice of the policeman, someone outside, a third person, saying, he's guilty, right? I hold him responsible. And the result, the effect of that, when the superego gets at one, it's not usually helpful. One can't really find a way to move on from there. The idea would be to come to a deeper sense of one's own inner world, which in a way allows one to take in what has happened. And I want also now to quote in this vein, this psychoanalytic vein, from Georges Bataille, the French philosopher. And I put the source, part of the source, at the end of your source page. If you look right at the end of the source page in number 13, Georges Bataille, in his theory of religion, he has a section on sacrifice. What does it mean to sacrifice. And this is a short section from a much longer, I excerpted from a much longer section. Not easy reading. The thing, right? What he wants to say, let me introduce it, is that there are two orders of reality. One order is the order of things. That is, things, objects in the world. We are among those things. We are bodies, right? We are objects. We are among those things. We serve purposes. We serve larger purposes. A thing has the value of a tool or an instrument, you know, to be instrumental in the world. If you are living in that order, then you have a sense that what you are most concerned with is to go on living as long as possible. The sense of duration. You want your things to stay solid and in existence for as long as possible. You don't want them to fall apart. And that is a particular perspective on life. I want to endure as long as possible. But there is another order, and that is what he calls the order of intimacy, the intimate order, which is quite different. It's exactly the opposite. In that order, the thing is sacrificed in order to achieve a kirvah, a closeness with God, with the spirit of the world, with the genius of life, somewhere moving away from the instrumental limitedness of one's physical existence. The thing, only the thing, is what sacrifice means to destroy in the victim. So when one offers an animal or a human being, the idea is to get rid of his thingness. It draws the victim out of the world of utility, right? That useful, instrumental world that we live in, takes it away from there, sacrifices it, and restores it to a world of unintelligible caprice. Suddenly, anything can happen. Everything can happen in one moment. Living totally in the moment of bliss, in the moment of union with God, the moment of the union with the nature of reality. The sacrificer, there's an R missing there, the one who sacrifices declares, this is what he is doing. Intimately, I belong to the sovereign world of the gods and myths. That's where I really belong, to the sublime world, right? I remember the world of my childhood, the books I read at that time, the sovereign world of myths and lofty meanings, to the world also of violent and uncalculated generosity, of great gestures that don't niggle, that are not formal, that are not normal, that are not normatic, right? The sublime gestures where a lot can be lost as well as everything being found. I withdraw you, victim, from the world in which you were and could only be reduced to the condition of a thing. I call you back to the intimacy of the divine world. And that is somewhere of the very essence of what sacrifice, what its passion is, what it tries to do, to set up a counter value to the thingy value of just going on being in the world. In doing so, there's a very beautiful sentence he uses. In doing so, in encountering that withdrawing of thingness, we uncover a ground of things that is dazzlingly bright. We get rid of all the opaque, cloudy things, and suddenly there is great brilliance, which is the ground of reality. Now, this is mystical, it's anthropological, it's a description on some real level of a motive force that is there in all cultures and all religions, the will to sacrifice. He says it's not necessarily a will to kill anything, the animal, but it's a will to relinquish and to give without limit, right? Nothing normatic about this. To give in a completely unregulated way, it's a movement towards the fire, things being consumed in the fire. One gives as one gives a coal to the fire, right? It doesn't have to be a life. And this intimacy then exists in the trembling of the individual person who is a thing, who is very bounded, trembling as he faces his own death, as he faces the end of his limited life and on the prospect of uniting himself with that large intimacy of the world and of God. Now, these ideas are rather exotic, but they somehow ring true. And I want to try to think for a moment about the relationship between his notion here of the consuming fire into which the sacrifice goes, and that movement of sacrifice, and the fire that in the end consumes the sons of Aaron, because they have no capacity for intimacy, because in a way they are dealing only with things. They're dealing only with rituals and things that you can make use of to make things happen. They live in a kind of anti-intimate world. And when I think of what might be the Jewish part of this conversation, the rabbinic part of this conversation, I think, for instance, of the fire, the consuming fire, into which Moshe disappears before the eyes of the whole people at the end of the giving of the Torah, right? At the very last, chapter 24. At the end of that narrative, Moshe goes up to the top of the mountain where there is a consuming fire, right? The appearance then, there was a vision of consuming fire. That was God, Mar'eh Kvod Hashem. That was the vision of a glory of God, was like a consuming fire there at the top of the mountain. And Moshe disappears into it. And that is the people's impression of the total assumption, the total giving up of one's individual life and going into the danger of intimacy with God. And that image is followed up in various ways. It's limited, it's conditioned, which reminds me of the great vision of consuming fire, of course, which was Moshe's first experience of God when he met him at the burning bush. That burning bush, it was burning in fire. It had that's what fire does. Fire consumes. But Moshe notices something that makes him turn out of his way. He's going along on his normal shepherdly way, and suddenly he looks to the side and he sees a fire with a bush that burns in fire and is not consumed. And here, this is the astonishing thing, right? This is the fire that's not doing fire. It's not doing what you now expect if you have an educated, symbolic imagination. You know that fire is consumed, and that's the nature of religious life. It's a kind of given. And suddenly he sees a fire offering itself there that is not consuming what is in it. And God addresses Moshe then, and he speaks to him. Go on my mission, he says. And Moshe knows a dangerous mission when he hears it. He feels completely unfit by it. He's being asked to approach the fire, perhaps because of his own reasons of not being able to speak, be feeling unfit on various levels. And he says, God says, go on my mission, b'shlichuti. And he answers, send anyone else you like on this mission except me. Shlach na biyad tishlach. Meaning, no. I don't want any consuming fire. I don't want to be consumed. He understands the danger. And God answers him according to Rashi. Look at this bush, just as it was burning in fire and was not consumed, so you will go on my mission and you will not be damaged. Velo nizok. You will not be damaged. In other words, the fire of God is now presented, right, as a kind of second order fire. The first order is the assumption that God is a consuming fire. That's obvious. Everyone understands that. Not hospitable to human beings. How do you find a place there with God? And then there's a second order of understanding a different kind of intimacy where God somehow makes place. There was the theme of hospitality that we talked about. That God makes space, that God finds you chaviv, that he finds you beloved and precious and dear, and he makes space in some way so that you can go on God's mission and just about make it. Not be concerned about duration and be able to experience something that can be called dvikut, clinging to God. So perhaps the Jewish take on the mysticism of consuming fires and of total sacrifice is one in which, right, with the command, Dvekim b'Hashem, chayim v'atem hadvekim b'Hashem, chayim kolchem hayom. You who cling to God are all of you alive today. So it's a new twist. Right? The image has gone through. It's gone through a variation now. It's a further playing with the image. It's an unconsuming fire. And sages ask, how can you cling to God? God is a consuming fire. Right? They come out with a cliche image, right? With the idol, as it were. Right? The image that's given somewhere. Right? God is a consuming fire. And then they answer, no. How do you get close to God? By getting close to people who are close to God. I won't go into the details. There are various laws, various suggestions, being close to the godly. In other words, these are human interactions in the world that make one in some way able to enter into that conversation with God, a relationship with God, which is called clinging to God, but it's mediated by human situations, human relationships, and a relationship with oneself, so that one can be with God. Im HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And God suggests all this to Moshe at the Sneh through the simple word Ehyeh. The burning bush, God says to Moshe, when Moshe, again, wants to have a thing, he wants to hold on to something. You know, what do I have to hold in my hand? When they'll ask what your name is. And God answers, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I will become what I will become. Ehyeh is the answer to the idolatrous instinct, to the total consuming understanding. That is, that there is a way of being consumed without being consumed, of clinging in a way that does not destroy you. You can keep your individuality. You don't yield to the idolatrous totality, and you find a way of being with God. It's a relationship with God. Now, this notion, of course, stands against the what Eric Zantner, who I quote quite a bit in this series of talks, and who I use, I think, very centrally in my book on Leviticus. Eric Zantner, Santner, has a book called The Psychotheology of Everyday Life. Be that as it may, what he speaks about, that's relevant to us at this point, is Yetziat Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt, as essentially leaving the idols of Egypt. Now that has a very good midrashic and Hasidic base. He doesn't quote, that's not his field. But that leaving Egypt means leaving the idols of Egypt. He calls it leaving the Egyptomania of yourselves. Leaving your own Egyptomania. The mania that you find in yourself that has to do with Egypt, Mitzrayim, Mitzarim, with that constricted place of Metzar, where there is a kind of literal, concrete understanding of things, where somewhere the idol is the idol, and you give yourself over entirely and totally to the idol, and are not capable of in some way using your imagination to move on from the thing to the intimacy with the thing which I'm trying to negotiate. And in that sense, there is now a great desire by the people, which leads the sons of Aaron to reify, right? There is actually a word from the Latin that means to thingify, to make into a thing the process of God's presence coming to dwell, which is, of course, a kind of absurdity. But it comes from that normotic, right? that desire to use cultic language, to use cultic practices as normally one has been taught them, to practice them, to use them to make things happen that one wants to happen. How can one overcome that kind of short-circuiting passion, which really takes one nowhere near the Ehyeh mode, the mode of becoming what I shall become, the desire to give birth to new images, not to just stay with the stagnant and enslaving old images. Have a look at Yes. Number 9. Number 9. 40 years after the golden calf and after the story of the spies, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moshe remembers the night of the spies, actually. It's really a different story is what he remembers. And he reminds the people of what happened 40 years ago. He said, I remember that night of weeping when you were sulking in your tents and you were saying, because God hated us, he took us out of Egypt. In other words, you had somewhere a sense that God hated you. And you wept all night out of that sense that God hated you. Where does that come from? A number of the commentaries say this is the people feeling guilty throughout the years, right till the end of their time in the desert. They feel guilty about their idolatry, which went back to Egypt and never really ceased. That in some way it goes on in them, and they feel guilty about that, right? The ghost of the golden calf somewhere still continuing in them. And it creates a feeling that God must hate them, that God must in some way be hostile to them and is now going to bring them to a terrible end where the peoples of the land of Israel their armies will come and crush them and grind them to pieces. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, God didn't hate you, but you hate God. Now that's a very strong statement. And he goes on to talk about the process of the dynamic that we call, in psychoanalysis, psychological talk, we call projection. What you think about someone else, you project it out upon them. You put it into them. The people say God hates them because they have a kind of uneasiness with the God who is Ehyeh. The God who is constantly, in a sense, evolving and demanding us to evolve, asking of us to be free people, right? Difficile liberté. Emmanuel Levinas, the French philosopher, calls one of his books difficult freedom, the movement away from that attachment to the idol, who can sometimes be Moshe. Moshe perhaps fills that place of the idol. I think we came across that idea in Rashi. Or sometimes even God himself. Right? In one's relation to God, one treats him, as it were, as if he were. It's the inability, and I want to put it through a pun, which I think is very meaningful, it's the inability to hold back, the inability somewhere to sit and be patient, to wait for things to evolve. It's that compulsion, kind of defensive compulsion, to make things happen, which is in a way at the heart of idolatry, to have it happen now. The thing, I want the thing itself. Whereas what God is suggesting and provoking them to is something much more difficult. That Ehyeh mode, right, the mode in which one can find the strength in oneself to hold out against that Egyptomania, which is a kind of stagnation, right? It's a kind of paralysis. There you are, stuck and unable to confront the stuckness. Nadav and Avihu become, in a way, avatars of this. Somewhere they have a frenzy. The word that's used in the midrash, they have a frenzy, right? A frenzy to fill the gap in the routine, to do things, to make things happen. Right? The word that's used in the midrash is they were lehutim acharei Shechina. What a powerful, strange expression. Lehutim, lahut, means to be on fire, to be inflamed, to be intoxicated, to be infatuated. It always has a slightly negative meaning. Right? It's to be in love, infatuated. Lahut, I can almost hear the hotness of it. An adolescent passion, an immature passion of some kind that hasn't allowed itself to grow, to sit, to wait. They were in love with the Shekhinah. They were infatuated with the Shekhinah. And that's a very daring statement in the midrash. And in that situation, right, somewhere the midrash analyzes this. and says, in that situation, what you have when people are lahut after the Shekhinah, you have then the possibility of the splitting. I will have my religion, you'll have your religion, factionalism, people will break into groups because each one has their own particular form of fantasy, and they're fixed in that imagining, and there is no getting them to talk to one another or to talk to God. Right? Somewhere the God is fixated, they are fixated. It's a kind of fetishism. I think that's probably the best word. It's fetishizing. These are fetishizing practices, the practices of idolatry, and the emotion behind them is that kind of adolescent heat, that adolescent infatuation, intoxication, which basically has about it something quite unimaginative. That is, it has about it something normotic. It's all too normal. You know, teenage girls screaming over an idol, right? A singing idol, yes, right? There's something really banal about that. It's passionate, all right, but there's something in which humanity is not being allowed to grow. There is no flexibility, there's no turning towards something else, something elsewhere than right here and now. In a way, the egel, the golden calf, was meant to make sense of chaos. We have an idol we can look at, and that will make sense of everything. Rather than, and here is the pun I left hanging over a while back, rather than being boshesh. Boshesh, that is, accept delay, to see that Moshe is late in coming down the mountain. That's the word that's used at the beginning of the golden calf story. And seeing that Moshe was late, they immediately make the idol to fill that vacuum. They can't hold on. They can't hold their place, lishmor. And the result is, since they can't be boshesh, they end up with a sense of busha. Boshesh and busha have the same root, actually. No, let me put it differently. There are two different roots, Beit Vav Shin and Beit Shin Shin. Beit Vav Shin is bosh, to be ashamed, and Beit Shin Shin is to be delayed, to be held back, to be in a world of process, in a world in which things have to be allowed to evolve, which is a very human world, and it's an intolerable world sometimes to confront oneself as living in. One wants the flash of fire, one wants the lahit, one wants somewhere to hit, you know, to celebrate in one consuming moment, which is, after all, part of the instinct for sacrifice, somewhere to do exactly that. Have a look now in the light of this attempt to analyze what is at work in that infatuation of the sons of Aaron that results in their being all too normative and all too limited in what they do. Have a look now at number 10, Shir HaShirim Rabbah. This is on a verse in the Song of Songs in which the beloved is praised, celebrated for her beautiful neck in beads. She has beautiful beads round her neck. And out of this material we have this midrash, which is perhaps the greatest celebration of the conversation of intimacy that is set up between the human being and God within a Jewish perspective on intimacy, on the order of intimacy. Ben Azai was sitting and teaching, right, expounding Torah in the mode of drasha, of midrash, and there was fire, milahetet svivotav. The essential word is missing there. Milahetet. There's that word, flaming around him. Lahut. There was a flame of fire surrounding them. People went then and told Rabbi Akiva, you know, Ben Azai is sitting there and teaching Torah, and fire is flaming around him. There is the word, milahetet. It's a verb here, it's not an adjective. It's the fire that's flaming around them. Somewhere, everyone is very exercised by this vision. What are they so agitated about? I'm suggesting that in part, there is a sense of, where does that fire come from? Is it strange fire? Is it fire from God? What are we dealing with here? And perhaps even more pointedly, why doesn't it burn him up? There's flaming fire around him, and it doesn't consume him. He's sitting there just teaching Torah calmly in the middle of all that. And then Rabbi Akiva then goes to Ben Azai and says to him quietly, I've heard that you are sitting and teaching Torah and the fire is flaming around you. So for the third time we've heard this little mantra. You are sitting and teaching with fire flaming. We can't forget it now. Right? In some way we're surrounded by that fire now. What is that fire? There's an urgent question here. What are you doing? Asks Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai answers calmly, yes, that's true. That's exactly right. And then Rabbi Akiva says to him, have you perhaps been practicing the illegitimate arts, mystical arts of the chariot, something that human beings are not supposed to dabble in? And Ben Azai answers, no. But what I'm doing is just sitting here and threading beads, chorez, there's that word, charuzim, the beads. I'm threading beads between words of Torah and words of the prophets and words of the prophets and words of the scriptures. I'm taking words that come from here and there and there. It's intertextual. I'm not reading remorselessly, trying to study something. I am, by association, by some kind of act of speculation, creative speculation, instinct, intuition, I know that these words have something to say to those words and to those words. And what happens then when I bring these words into contact with each other, from where they're different contexts, then the words are as happy, as joyful as when they were first given at Sinai, right? That original moment of revelation. And they are as sweet as the very moment of when revelation was first given. So there is a joy and a sweetness. There is the eros. There is the joy of love, which is sweet as well as joyful. And after all, wasn't that the mode in which the Torah was first given at Sinai? Doesn't it say that the Torah was given in fire? V'har bo'er ba'esh. That the mountain was burning in fire. What is Ben Azai saying? I think he's saying in a rather kind of almost provocatively domestic way, I've domesticated the fire. The fire is flaming, all right. That's the fire in which Torah is given. But I've generated it just by putting words, the words that have been given, in connection with each other and teaching that connection. That creates the fire. That's the electricity. That is, I'm sitting here and doing midrash. And that creative act is a way of retrieving the original moment of God's presence at Sinai. It's not a consuming fire. It's a fire that flames. It's not me that flames. I'm not in flames. I am surrounded by this fire, which is a sense of the intimacy that I've created between these words and those words and those words. And so I recognize it as, right, it's God's fire, but it's also home fire. It's fire that comes from a relationship with God and God's words. Now that is a version, I want to say, of what Bataille is talking about when he talks about the intimate order. For us, that is the learning of Torah. The learning of Torah, prayer, the life of connection with holiness in relation to other people, in relation to nature, in relation to anything and everything, in a mode of ehyeh, in a mode of the possibility for holiness, the possibility that arises, which demands a certain mutual effort to come together and to create that fire. Now that notion, I can't resist pointing out that word lahat, the fiery flame, is used of the turning swords. You remember the cherubs, the angels, who stand at the gate of the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve are driven out of the Garden of Eden. There are those, it's chapter 3, verse 24, I think. I didn't put it on your page. We had a lot. And there is a blade, a sword, cherev mithapachet. There is a flaming, turning sword. Midrash Gadol says this. It's not the sword that's turning. It's the angels themselves that are transforming themselves as they're standing there. They are transfigured. They are replacing what the Garden of Eden has, right? The human couple have now lost eternal life. They've lost that tree of life which is at the center of the garden. They've lost the thing. And now they have to move into the world outside Eden, which is the symbolical world. It's the world in which you create translations for something once known, which the translation is both less and more than the original. Right? It approximates in a different language to the original. What is that in terms of the midrash? It's Torah. That is, that lahat is the lahat of Torah, of a certain kind of enthusiasm, a certain kind of fire that's given off by Torah, which itself is intoxicating. What is the intoxication? I think there's a kind of sober aspect to this. On the one hand, the intoxication is the joy and the sweetness, the erotic intimacy that's created with God and with words of Torah. But it's also, in some sense, it's the sobriety of learning Torah with all one's mind, one's intellect, one's common sense, one's way of distinguishing between things, not only connecting between them, which keeps one somewhere outside, right, outside the heart of fire, so that one is not consumed. And that is described in this midrash, in Midrash Gadol, really astoundingly, as when a human being then experiences those angels which bar his way back to the real thing, then hu chozer ledato. A human being returns to his own mind, to his own sanity, to his own stuckness, to his own actual issues in life, the things that hold him and that one would love to just ignore or defend against. And in that place, perhaps, something can then emerge. He calls it Torah. Torah, which has to do both with the sanity and with the love, the erotic, which are what a human being looks for in a relationship with God. I want to finish with the last midrash very quickly, number 11. So if we come back to Nadav and Avihu, what can we say about them? What is the meaning of this strange story? As I said at the beginning, any number of possible interpretations. What do we do with all that? All right, I gave an interpretation now. One can sit with it, one can one can work with it. But, go and look at Ramban, go and look at the Or HaChaim. You will find many, many different versions of meaning. So what is the truth? What was the reason that they were punished in this way? And here you have a passage in Midrash and Vaikra Rebbe that quotes from the book of Job, Eov. Af lazot yecharad libi v'yitzar mimkomo. Even at this, my heart shudders, trembles, and it jolts out of place. It's a moment of cataclysm towards the end of the book of Job. What is it? Right? Plain meaning is there's a storm, there's a thunderstorm, there's lightning, and at the sight of the lightning, my heart jolts out of place. Describing in a very real way the effect of a violent storm on one's physical and emotional being. What is that word, v'yitar, asks the Midrash? It's a strange word. We don't have it very often. But we do have it in the book of Vayikra, to do with certain kinds of animals. It means to leap, like certain kinds of insects. When in the laws of kashrut, which animals and insects are kasher, are able to be eaten, ones that have a kind of leaping faculty, that they have an extra joint, you can eat them. Right? And the expression that's used there is lenater bahen al haaretz. They leap upon the earth. So here is a very legal text brought to explain the meaning of the leaping heart, the jolting heart. And here, God says, before I get to what God says, that kosher insect, some form of locust, Rashi says about that, all right, in theory it's permissible, but we will never know which one it really is. We can't make practical use of this because the conditions in which this insect are just too complicated. There are too many conditions we don't know exactly which insect is really referred to in reality. So we can't actually make any practical meaning out of this kosher label. And here, the same idea, God says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shouldn't the children of Aaron be at least like his stick? Strange thing to say. Aaron's staff. You remember the story of Aaron's staff? To identify him as the true priest, his staff flowered while it was inside the sacred space. Shouldn't the children of Aaron be at least like his staff? The staff went in dry, just a dry stick, and it came out moist and fruitful, flowering. And then an apparent non sequitur. What about Titus Haresha, the wicked king, the wicked emperor of Rome, Titus? Take him, for instance. Suddenly it seems as if the midrashic imagination is going wild, going all over the place now. Titus, that wicked emperor, he entered into the Holy of Holies with his sword outstretched, unguarded, drawn, his sword drawn in his hand. He dragged the curtain, pull it aside as he goes into the intimacy, that sacred intimacy, that dangerous place at the center. And he goes in there and he comes out of there with his sword full of blood. Nichnas b'shalom v'yatza b'shalom. He went in perfect calm, and he went out, well, calm isn't the word, it means unscathed. He went in unscathed and he came out unscathed after having violated the heart of the mystery, having gone in there and actually done the impossible pollution, act of pollution, murder probably as well. He went in unscathed and came out unscathed, and the children of Aaron went in to offer sacrifices, and they came out burned, as it says, after the death of the children of Aaron. What is the midrash saying here? It's setting up what I would call charuzim, pairings. It's saying, how can we understand what happened to the children of Aaron? I can only understand it when I compare it to something else. And when I do that, what I realize is that there's no possibility of understanding anything. For instance, if I compare the children of Aaron to their staff, the staff went in dead, as it were, and came out alive. They went in alive, and they came out dead. Why is there such a prejudice against them if we compare them to, they had good motivations, they went into sacrifice. Or, again, another analogy. It comes somewhere from, we don't know from where. The worst person you can possibly imagine. He was in the equivalent situation. He also went into the most sacred place, and he'd committed the most heinous offenses, and he came out all bloody and triumphant. And they went in for pure purposes to sacrifice to God, and they came out burned. And suddenly you have again this almost hallucinatory series of images of bloody swords and of burned people, and flowering rods. And suddenly we're not in the world simply of common sense. The common sense question that says it's very hard to find meaning in the world. What about the righteous and the wicked? Everyone comes to the same end. That's one way that some midrashic sources want to say there is no making meaning in the world. That actually, if you look around, there's no answers to these questions. But that's a rather banal way of doing it. Everyone dies at the end. So then in that sense, what is the meaning of being a righteous person as opposed to a wicked person? Morality doesn't seem to have any effect on the way things actually play out. But that's a banal thing. What this midrash does is much more creative. It does what we've been told one should do. That is, it takes two situations which are in a way created for the purpose. It's an intertextual comparison, and points up the absurdity. that he gets off scot-free, and he does the same thing, but for good purposes, and he gets burnt. In other words, it's a way of, bottom line, of saying there are too many explanations. There isn't one that really, finally, totally makes sense. If you look for rationalistic answers, as the midrash does, in itself, many different answers. What did they do wrong? They were intoxicated, they didn't have children, they didn't have a wife, and so on and so on. Does that lead you to think in the end, what a rational, blissfully meaningful place the world is? No, not at all. When you think of this particular story, which is one of the two stories in the book of Leviticus, you can only end up by throwing up your hands. That this is a situation, this particular story gives us a story in which it's very hard to come to any surefire explanation of what to do and what to avoid. So that even the explanation that I enjoyed so much, I really liked talking about that being normotic, and that being the problem, not being open to the unaccountable nature of God, that God can in some way act openly and freely, and we haven't got him well regulated. Even that explanation is one among many possible explanations. So the reader is left somewhere, my heart jolts within me. And that's what the midrash wants to say. When I realize that there is no answer in this world, what can I do? What do the people do when the glory of God does appear with the cost of the two young men? They sing and they fall on their faces. They can't understand anything. But what do you do when you can't understand? You break out in a kind of overwhelmed moment of complex joy and sorrow. A sense somewhere of the pain that can't be explained, and we can't bestow meaning on it as hard as we will, as hard as we try, on the one hand, and on the other hand, at the same moment, the grounds for joy and the presence of God that has manifested itself in a fire that does two very different things. And that moment of exaltation of song has to be without words. You no longer have the words. Back then at the Red Sea, you were still somewhere in a state of just redeemed innocence. But now you've been through certain things, and now you know that the story is complex, and that the meanings of God's presence are ones that we will throughout Sefer Vayikra and throughout life, I suppose, we'll have to find ways of entering into conversation with, find ways of creating a possible enactment of Ehyeh, of God's active being in the world. Okay, next week, which will be the last of this set of 4, then we'll have Pesach, and then Bezrat Hashem, after Pesach, 2 more sessions on the last parts of Vayikra. Next week we'll be looking, of course, at Tazria Mitzara, the leprosy, the impurity, the laws of purity and impurity, with all their difficulty for us as moderns, and with their specific focus on the impurity that's known as the skin disease called Tzarat and its possible meanings. Thank you.